started. So I'm here, I'm Melissa Gilbert, I'm Chair of Geography and Urban Studies, and I'm here to welcome you to the Urban Futures Conference on behalf of the Global Studies Program, the Department of Geography and Urban Studies, and also the Center for Sustainable Communities at Temple. Again, I'm Chair of Geography and Urban Studies. I just want to tell you a little bit about the department. We have so many students here. And what we focus on are the themes of sustainability, globalization, social justice, and geographic methods. And we house undergraduate and graduate programs in geography and urban studies, environmental studies, and GIS, and geographical information systems. I'm also the director of the Center for Sustainable Communities, which conducts integrated social and environmental research on sustainability issues. And right now, the center is in a year of developing a strategic plan to figure out how we're going to spend the next 10, 15 years on research and educational activities. So this conference, the Urban Futures Conference, is a big part of that planning process. And the conference is focusing on how urban environments are understood and governed and experienced by people living in cities so that we can kind of envision a more sustainable, more just future for cities. So the outcomes of this event, we had a lot of speakers this morning who were terrific, and we're going to have our keynote, and then we have a panel this afternoon. And so these are all kind of feeding into what we're going to be doing on the sort of future educational and research programs around sustainability. So I want to thank Dr. Tamil Pearsall and Tina Roseanne, who organized this fantastic conference. And I want to thank all of our presenters who have joined us, as well as the people attending. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Tamil Pearsall, who's going to introduce our speaker.
So hi, thank you all for being here, for coming today to our keynote talk for this event. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Isabelle Anguelovski, who's here from Barcelona, where she is leading a very impressive project called Green Lulus that looks at greening and equity implications of greening in 40 cities across Western Europe and North America. So we're going to be hearing some of that research today. She has her PhD from MIT in planning, a degree in nonprofit management from Harvard, and she also has degrees in international development from Sorbonne and Sciences Po in France. So I welcome Isabelle up to the stage and look forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Hamid, for having me here. Thanks, Melissa, as well. It's a pleasure to be back in the US. Every time I go back, I'm like, wow, it's exciting. I'm going back to the US, my kind of home where I spent 10 years. But at the same time, when I come in, people expect me to present what we do in Europe or what also we've been researching on in Latin America. So I try to have a balance of research areas and geographical focuses. So anyway, my talk today is called Green Cities for All, or Enclaves of Environmental Privilege. It is driven by a deep motivation that I've had for quite a long time now in relationship to how cities can become more green, sustainable, healthy, and just at the same time. So right now I'm based in Barcelona, where I direct a research center together with James Connolly, who is another colleague who got his PhD in the US. And we are both interested in building a greater community of environmental justice scholars in cities in Europe, so we happen to be based in Barcelona. And at the same time, to being these kind of transnational ties, looking at the ways in which different cities around the world are challenged by these, it seems nowadays, incompatibility between environmental projects for cities and justice and equity. So you are welcome to stop by. We do a lot of great conferences, at least we try to make them. We have interns as well who come and work with us, and we develop research that is oftentimes funded by the European Union that also allows for international collaboration. So as I was saying, my talk today is motivated by these broader policy questions, and then the research questions I will be bringing into the talk, but the question is the following. Can green cities be green, healthy, and just altogether? Or are we noticing a conundrum, a paradox, that is still impossible to solve nowadays? So my talk is articulated around 4 areas. The first one, which is a little bit of a theoretical background on the literature that motivates a lot of my work, which is the intersection of environment, health, and equity in cities. I'm then going to move into the more recent evolution, you could say, of the urban environmental justice field, which is environmental gentrification, what and why now in particular. And then I will bring in different methods, different case sites to explore the ways in which environmental gentrification manifests in different cities in the global north and south. So I'll have a more in-depth presentation about Medellin, Colombia, and then I will talk about the recent project that we've been leading at our lab, which is called the Green Lulus Project, and that looks at urban green inequity and gentrification in Europe, Canada, and the United States. So, as some of you might know, I think knowing the research that Tina and Hamel have been doing in the center and at the same time in the department, and then the classes you've been taking, I imagine that quite a lot of you know about environmental justice, the literature of environmental justice. Basically, the main argument is that historically, lower income residents and minority residents have been disproportionately impacted by negative land uses and extractive industries or contaminating factories, more generally speaking. And there is a lot of literature that statistically or geographically has used different methods to prove this disproportionate exposure, disproportionate impact faced by lower income and minority residents. Linked to that, obviously, this environmental exposure to different forms of contaminants has led to what we know as environmental health inequities or health disparities. So if you take this map of TRI facilities are toxic facilities in the United States that are obliged by law to report their emissions. You see a superposition of where those facilities are and where the higher percentage of non-white residents are living. So in that sense, a health inequity is a difference or disparity in health outcomes that is systematic, avoidable, and unjust. And that's, in a way, what this talk is looking at. And so moving beyond the brown stuff, like what we know is obvious in terms of producing health inequity, we also want to look at different ways in which cities, which are redeveloping, which are changing land use, and oftentimes are converting vacant lots or contaminating sites like brownfields into green spaces, the ways in which new types of inequities are produced. In the United States, in Rio, for instance, or in Valencia, Spain, every time that these new green spaces, especially the large green infrastructure, are being created. So in general, how do cities talk about green space and health? And why am I talking about this green rhetoric now? I think it's very important because there's a widely known or widely used practice that is called a green rhetoric or green talk, if you wish. And it's being perpetuated by environmental planning agencies in cities, by health practitioners, or by public health researchers in general, calling for the city to be green, active, dense, etc. So cities, in a way, have an apolitical health agenda that is around green space and greening. It makes it more beautiful, it makes the city more healthy with air, water, trees, parks, etc. These are 2 examples of green plans that cities in the United States have developed over the past 10 years to kind of justify this greening agenda, this greening lens. And so if you go back to the core of the literature that is on the relationship between urban green space, which is the focus of the talk today, of green infrastructure and health, you can see different pathways in which new green space or exposure to green space, or what is known in the health literature as NOE, natural outdoor environment, is producing. You have the natural environment with new parks. The quality of those spaces matters a lot. The amount of spaces matter a lot. Obviously, having a greater tree canopy helps capture carbon emissions or other types of emissions. That requires a deep also contact with nature, so not just being exposed to a view, but also a regular contact via physical activity, via visiting parks, for instance. And at the same time, human and social contacts developing in those spaces. which in the end is supposed, or at least the health literature tells us, that there's a very strong relationship between exposure, access to green space, especially active exposure to green space, and improved health outcomes and well-being, either self-perceived well-being, chronic stress, depression, cardiovascular diseases, especially through pathways of physical activity. So there is a positive relationship. Some of my colleagues, for instance, in Barcelona, have done the following research showing that the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality is 4% lower, and that of all-cause mortality 8% lower for residents with high residential exposure to green spaces. And so what a lot of these researchers are doing now is conducting what is called health impact assessments, looking at the number of deaths avoided, or the number of years being extended in someone's lives for being exposed to green space. However, there starts to be a little caveat in the relationship, because it's not just about tree density and then the correlation with health factors and health outcomes. There's a whole set of variables on the left, and actually here from the research, I would say that there is ethnicity and race, which is missing, that will, in the end, have a contributing role, or in a way a mediating role, in the relationship between exposure to green space and health. So it's, age, sex, education, diet, income, and race matters in the way in which we understand the ways in which green space impacts health. So for instance, if you take the case of Los Angeles, there are huge disparities in park access. If you look at this little design brochure produced by a nonprofit in Los Angeles, you will see that on average, white kids have access to 96 acres of green space, whereas black kids have access to 3 acres, Latinos to 5, and Asian kids to 6. So there are huge disparities in access to green space and health. And I'm not even talking here about the quality of green space. I'm not talking here about even the physical accessibility of green space, whether it's by public transit or cars. And of course, many residents of lower income backgrounds don't have access to a car, and many of those parks are only accessible by private mode of transportation. So if I go back to my initial questions, can green cities be healthy and just? I'm posing it in the context of nowadays many cities redeveloping land or redeveloping old infrastructure, gray infrastructure into green infrastructure, in particular using old railways like these ones in Barcelona, which is now converted into the equivalent of our High Line, the Jardins de la Rambla de Sants. And am I asking myself, or I'm asking you guys, will this High Line of Barcelona, the Jardins de la Rambla de Sants, be a public good for all, or will it become this enclave of environmental luxury that the High Line in New York has become, where some of the buildings here built by Zaha Hadid Studios, and where the penthouse cost $50 million. And I think that in the context of many cities, again, emphasizing the role of green space in producing sustainability and improved health, this is a pretty valid question. And I'm bringing it back here to the theory of environmental justice, thinking about some of the previous work that I've been doing in Barcelona, Boston, and Havana, thinking about what green spaces, when they are community-driven, where they are in environmental justice communities that have been plagued by white flight to the suburbs, by segregation, or by redlining, what role those green spaces have played for them. And in the one health, they have improved physical health, and on the other hand, they have also created places of refuge and environmental safe havens. That's part of a book that I published a few years ago that really tried to examine the ways in which environmental projects are tools, are segues to address much deeper goals of addressing environmental trauma in particular, and creating places where people can feel nurturing, healing, protective, and wellness. And that's particularly important, again, for communities that are historically out of the map and where green spaces might not anymore be seen as an environmental good or something desirable for them to ask for, but rather as a place for new forms of segregation and a place of environmental privilege. So for whom is the new green city? And the argument I want to develop in this talk today, through the variety of examples I'm going to bring in, is that these green amenities are increasingly creating conditions for the social spatial exclusion and invisibilization of the most racially and socially vulnerable residents, their livelihoods, and their practices. And some of you might know the literature in urban planning that talks about LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, which are generally referred to as contaminating sites or polluting factories. Here I'm making a little bit of offense, thinking that maybe these spaces are becoming green LULUs. They are becoming spaces that are more and more undesirable in those neighborhoods. And I'm not saying, on the other hand, that they shouldn't be there, but I'm saying, are they becoming undesirable in those neighborhoods, especially from the perceptions of the residents who've left to fight, who have fought to remain and live in those neighborhoods and who might now be at risk of exclusion. And this is when the latest part, the latest piece of the puzzle in the environmental justice literature comes in, which is the literature on environmental gentrification. The idea behind this literature is that when cities are planning to remodel their land use and change brownfields or change vacant lands into green spaces, these forms of dynamics are intertwined with new types of inequality reformation and gentrification. And so there's a form of gap in the end in terms of existing profit on a site versus the potential profit that can be gleaned from a site, which we call the green gap. So that's in another paper I'm not really bringing in today. But the idea of the literature in urban geography is that oftentimes neighborhoods have a rent gap. That's what Neil Smith tells you. Here in that particular case, we see that with greening becoming this new orthodoxy, similarly to resilience, that is also another form of resiliency, and that is being brought together with smart. So the smart, green, resilient, add whatever you want to add there, the density. You have a form of green gap that cities want to take advantage of in a way that can achieve greater economic growth. If you think about the literature that helps us understand the process of green gentrification, you have to look at the real estate economics literature. So people like Dan Immergluck, for instance, have been following the ways in which the demographic and the real estate characteristics of neighborhoods that are receiving environmental infrastructure are evolving over time. So what Dan Immergluck says in the case of Atlanta, Atlanta has received a new green belt over the last 10 years, 15 years. And his research shows that the properties that are situated within 400 meters, which is not very much, 400 meters of a green infrastructure, can spike by 30% in terms of their price in comparison with similar properties basically a mile away from them. So a quarter of a mile versus a mile away. And other literature is being produced looking at, again, the ways in which the demographic and the real estate characteristics of neighborhoods are changing. So what is environmental gentrification, if you want to pinpoint the definition of it? It's a process of implementing an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. And this ethic part is very important because, again, developers, real estate agents, public officials, planners are selling ethic as a public good for all that benefits everyone in the city. Kenneth Gould and Tammy Lewis, who are two sociologists at CUNY, also point at a different dynamic, which is that wealthier groups are able to purchase high-quality homes and reap the benefits from environmental goods and amenities being created in vulnerable neighborhoods, while shifting environmental burden to the most marginalized neighborhoods. And what's important here is that as you are being displaced in your neighborhood because of processes of land value creation and increasing property values, you are being displaced to the neighborhoods that are the brownest in terms of the contamination or in terms of the least environmental benefits those neighborhoods are able to produce. So you have this social spatial shift that exists in the city because of the creation of new green infrastructure. And again, there are different forces here that help you produce those forms of dynamics. Developers, elected officials, planners, and policymakers, especially to the forms of tax breaks and zoning or rezoning that benefit high-end developers, and also the private residents themselves, who oftentimes lobby neighborhood organization or the city to change the rules of parks that are being deeply rehabbed or deeply restored, so that former residents or former users of the park, that's what we call interactional justice in my field, are not being respected anymore or are being outlawed. So for instance, in the Marcus Garvey Park in New York, when it became restored, black drummers were unallowed anymore to practice drumming in the park after the advocacy mobilized by the new upper-class white residents that moved into the vicinity of the park. That's another very brief example from New Orleans. The idea of New Orleans is to remove the I-10 overpass, which was built in the 1960s, and really scar the neighborhood, which was a historically black neighborhood, and make it into what we would call in Spanish a rambla, a greenway. The idea that it would increase the economic growth and the economic potential of this corridor, but for who? That's always the question in the end. Who would move into this beautiful green neighborhood half a mile away from downtown New Orleans? That's a good question. So to go more into that, into the landscapes of pleasure, privilege, and greenness, I want to bring you the case of Medellin a little bit closer to your eyes. So what's happening in Medellin? And this is an example of a greenway that was built in Medellin between 2011 and 2015, and it's a pilot product, or it's a pilot greenway, that is now being expanded to the whole Aburra Valley, which is a valley that, let's say, splits Medellin into Medellin, which is located in the Andes, and will continue to receive a lot of residents coming from the rural parts of the city and also the rural parts of the country, which are being victims of the previous armed conflict that still continue to bring more residents to the city. So what is a greenway? It's a 74 square kilometers project that was envisioned by the previous mayor, who was called Anguelovski, for the most innovative city in the world. You can start seeing this discourse of bringing Medellin up and rebranding Medellin from a city of crime and narco-traffic to a green and innovative and creative class city. Medellin does have a lot of problems related to climate change, a lot of problems related to extreme weather events, to landslides, to mudslides, and to a lot of residents living in the upper parts of the city, in the hill slides and slopes, and being at risk of these extreme weather events. Here's an example of this green belt and how this green belt is supposed to, in a way, control growth while protecting residents from social and environmental disasters. But the question to ask ourselves here is, how does city rebranding around green and resilience discourses and initiatives create displacement and exclusion? And what type of displacement? Because it's not only about people being displaced from their homes physically, it's also a form of social cultural displacement. So what has this green belt created? And maybe I should just go back very quickly to tell you a bit more about the green belt. So there is a part in green here in the drawing at the bottom that is the protection zone. So it's an area of the city where there will be no construction. It will be a natural reserve with a lot of parks and protected areas. Then there is a yellow zone, which is called the zone of transition, the transition zone, where residents who are living in pretty precarious conditions are being moved to the lower part of the green belt, which is the part in orange, which is called the consolidated area. And this area in yellow is supposed to have metropolitan parks, bike paths, trails, etc. And then the part in orange is supposed to be densified and consolidated. The problem is that, as the residents are telling us, I mean, we did a lot of field work there, there's a problem of what they call a green belt of questions, a belt of questions. In that sense, is how is relocation of the residents who are being moved away from the upper parts of the infrastructure lower into the city being managed. And here we see a lot of relocation controversies in the sense that residents who are being displaced by the green belt are not being relocated in situ, and they are being relocated in high towers, high skyscrapers at the lower part of the city, losing access to social networks, to jobs, and in general, they are being relocated without their families. So you have to think about the context of the city that has grown a lot because of the armed conflicts, and 3-4 families living in one single dwelling. Nowadays, these people are being relocated away it's very difficult to find housing for them. The city also has a limitation there in its capacity, its institutional capacity to absorb all of these residents. So people are being split up, they move into other families, and in the end, there is a sense of isolation, while also the problem of overcrowding and right to housing exists. There's also a problem of risk overestimation. The city is overestimating risks and moving residents away, while technical studies from local universities are assuming, or if they are estimating, that rehab in situ, or what's called more like upgrading of housing in situ, is possible. While at the same time, that some of the housing in which they are being moved to, while at the same time losing access to their land, for instance. A lot of them have gardens at the bottom of the houses they built. At the same time, they're a form of selective displacement, meaning that residents who are from upper income strata and who also tend to be non-indigenous residents have the right to stay in these upper income skyscrapers that are being built or that were built above the height limit, above the altitude limit where the green belt was setting the limit to be, and they are not being moved. So they have the right to continue being built, and at the same time there are 2 more large housing projects that are being built now in an area that's called Via Las Palmas for upper-end residents. And it's being sold as a place of green, high quality of life with beautiful views over the city. So already, who has access to green in Medellin? So these are the skyscrapers that are the upper-income ones that can continue being there. There's also a problem of the military and growth construction machine, in the sense that this is a military base that is at the top of one of the lower income informal settlements in the city that is not being displaced. And that military base, according to the land use map of the city, is illegal. So it's a form of surveillance, a form of social spatial control by the military of lower income residents who have a deep distrust relationship with the military because of the history of the armed conflict. It's also a growth construction machine because, as you could see in the first map, it's a gray infrastructure more than a green infrastructure. There are pillars deep down in the ground that are more than 30 feet deep. Everything is stone-based. So it is not a green infrastructure in the sense that it respects the vernacular form of infrastructure of the residents or the land use pattern. It's actually a form of hard infrastructure that residents feel is putting a form of seal over their neighborhood and preventing easy social spatial movements. I'm passing on that quickly to continue on that point. In the end, what this green belt is also producing is a more manicured, a more artificial form of green infrastructure where all of the ecological knowledge that has been accumulated by the residents since they were living there is being erased for this more hard infrastructure and is being sold as a place for leisure and recreation to cyclists, to visitors, to creative class users who now also have a cable car system that brings them up to the hill. So it's a form of disciplining nature and rejecting the form of natures and landscape preservation that many of the indigenous residents were doing. And you can see here again this very concrete construction of the green infrastructure, or the supposed green infrastructure in Medellin. What there is also in the end is an invisibilization of residents' relationship to nature. Because many of the plants that were planted in the green belt were non-native plants. Many of them did not respect erosion principles, and so many of them are actually increasing erosion rather than addressing erosion. And on the other hand, all of the community gardens that were sustainable from the point of view of residents and also from many ecological experts in the city are being torn down and being rebuilt in a form of more professional urban agriculture. So our urban agriculture in that particular case is professionalized, is marketed for upper income residents who live in the Poblado neighborhood where these skyscrapers are located, rather than being reincorporated and reinjected into the social economy of the community. So again, there's a very clear formalization and incorporation in the market economy of the urban agriculture built for the Medellin Green Belt, rather than an incorporation and an empowerment of the existing or the previous urban agriculture plots that the residents had. So that's an example of this construction of a formal plot for residents to farm in, but only very selected residents. And when you talk to the professionals of the urban agriculture program from the city about why they are doing that, they say, we're doing it because residents of the informal settlement of the comunas in the language there don't know how to farm. And they don't know how to eat properly. Only the people in the poblado, which are again really high-income neighborhoods, know how to eat. So there is a form of racialization and socialization of or social class structuration that really undermines and invisibilizes the practices of low-income residents for the privilege of the upper-income class. So there's a creation of a new Medellin, as this quote from a community leader is telling us. For the municipality, the Jardín Circunvalar is the redemption of Medellin, and it is created for skilled and prepared residents who are able to professionally compete, and for tourists who consume in the new spaces. The Jardín is not built for the people with little education and little ability to survive in the urban capitalist economy. Those are the ones who end up being expelled from their houses and facing again multiple forms of social and health and food risks. There is now this idea of false and impossible competition between residents of the comunas and higher classes and visitors that are now the emblem of the new Medellin. And there is also the risk, the perpetual risk of global trauma. I won't read those quotes, but residents feel that they are expelled twice from territories where they used to live, from the rural countryside and now from the hills that they came to occupy, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to in the context of the conflict. So again, this form of environmental trauma that the Green Belt, which is supposed to bring benefits for all, is creating for the least socially privileged residents in the city. So in conclusion about Medellin, green infrastructure emphasizes resilience, growth containment, to the exclusion of other elements of well-being and health, and also at the exclusion of the consideration of environmental equity. Containment and beautification through greening of 4 areas and through land grabbing, because it is a form of land grabbing, produces landscapes of pleasure and privilege, but for few, those who are the accepted new Medellin. In the end, the community is dispossessed 3 ways: of their assets, which was land, of their houses, and also of their social cultural practices in the city, which are being invisibilized through time and space for the greatest public good. And that's a form of environmental gentrification, if you could call it this way, even though you don't have yet, at least not yet, middle and upper income residents who are moving into the neighborhood to live there. That's why I think it's also important to think about environmental gentrification, not from the point of view of demographic or real estate shifts, but also from a form of cultural and social appropriation through a process of greening dispossession. I'm moving to the second and final part of the presentation, which is this project that Hamid was describing earlier, which is Green Lulus, and where we are studying in 40 cities, trying to study, because it's really hard, in 40 cities in the US, Canada, and Europe, the process of green gentrification through urban greening. So the research questions we are asking are the following. Under which conditions do municipally led greening projects in distressed neighborhoods actually redistribute access to environmental amenities, as opposed to these greening projects acting as a catalyst for rising property values, gentrification, and displacement of marginalized population? So the first question we ask, and we do that in 40 neighborhoods, or in 40 cities, are greener cities less racially and socially equitable, or are they more racially and socially equitable? And are there nuances in between our cities? That's why we take these 40 cities. Is that will there be cities that actually, as they become greener, have maintained or increased their social and ethnic diversities? We're also looking at the relationship between greening and investment patterns, because we're interested in the ways in which new forms of capital accumulation from the point of view of real estate developers and investors are being produced through greening. What type of benefits are developers harnessing from greening, and how do they, in this process, also restructure their investment strategies in the city to harness greening as a benefit for them? And then finally, in our cities, we're also looking at community mobilization, at resistant pattern, as the ways in which environmental justice groups are managing this difficult balance between asking for increased quality of life for residents, while knowing at the same time that those amenities increasing their quality of life might end up displacing them. And in this process, we also look at the policies and the tools that cities are putting in place to address risks of gentrification. I'm actually passing that because now that I've realized also who is in the room, I don't want to enter into the research design too much, but basically we're organized into 4 streams and 40 cities. So where are we at now? We are still in the first phase of the project. It's a project that's lasting five years. It's funded by the European Union, and we are around 15 of us working on the project at the moment. So what are we doing right now? We are first selecting our cities, and we've done an in-depth inventory of urban greening trajectories. We originally had 100 cities where we analyzed through a deep analysis of planning documents, land use maps, policy tools, different forms of urban greening interventions. Together, we complemented those with interviews. So we are looking at the ways in which cities have greened over time, the strategies and the discourses they have used. So we just concluded this piece in June last year, and what came out of it were 99 green trajectories, where we brought in also the timeline of greening projects. We looked in particular at urban nature and green space, and we did an intensive coding work and intercoder reliability to basically make sure that these greening trajectories were reflecting across the 15 of us these similar, let's say, focuses on green infrastructure and urban green spaces. What we also try to do here is to try to rank, or to try to provide some scores of what cities are doing and how they are doing it. So again, we did that for 99 cities that are spread pretty equally between the US, Canada, and Europe. Our cities are between 0.5 million and 1.5 million, so Philly is actually part of it. And the idea behind that is that we wanted to look at cities that are inserted in the global economy, while at the same time not being these mega cities where you have like almost 5 or 6 cities at the same time, and where it's very difficult to social-spatially relate some of the processes with one another. So what did we do here? We looked at the greening rhetoric, meaning when we talk, how do cities talk about themselves, and what role does urban greening seem to play in a general urban development strategy? How well is urban green space integrated into existing policies, into existing planning documents? We also look at the level of implementation of green spaces in each place. And we also looked at greening as a revitalization strategy in low-income and minority neighborhoods. And actually, there is a mistake. 4 should be with 5. Because what we are particularly interested here is understanding the extent to which equity is also a lens through which greening is being incorporated into city practice. So greening as revitalization strategy, universal access to green space, health and well-being benefits as justification for increasing green space, and finally procedural participation. How well are residents participating in urban greening? And again, there's a mistake. 4 should be with 5. So we really looked at different indicators of social equity and inclusion. It was more of this huge secondary analysis of those documents that we complemented with a few selected interviews, and also which we verified on the ground with a local expert. And so that's how the book looks like now. It's being produced in partnership with several European institutions and networks of sustainable cities. And it's called Municipal Policy Trends and Strategies for Greening in Europe, Canada, and the United States. And each of the trajectories looks a little bit the same, in the sense that, and the title for some reason got cut. So on the left you have Amsterdam, and then on the right you have Sheffield. So each of these 99 pages of documents has the same structure in terms of what type of greening the cities are doing, etc. But that's not the most important thing I want to present today. First, how are cities greening, and what are they doing, and what are the differences between Europe, Canada, and the United States? What you can see is that in general, The most important greening strategy that we find is the cleanup and redevelopment of post-industrial and declining landscapes. And we see a similar emphasis, I don't have a pointer, but you see a similar emphasis in the US and Canada. You also see quite a lot of work being done on revitalization and greening in underinvested downtown, historic areas, and other marginalized areas. Also in the preservation and conservation of green spaces. So there were a lot of neglected green spaces in those cities that are now being rehabbed, if you will, and deeply restored. You also see a lot of emphasis on green belts and ecological corridors. You have a lot of them in both continents. However, you also see quite a lot of difference. For instance, in the US, there's a lot of emphasis, despite in the end the current administration, but in the end, we're looking since 1990, so the current administration is not counting in the data analysis. You have a lot of emphasis on green infrastructure in the context of climate change, climate adaptation, and resilience in the US, much more than in Europe. And also, we have also in the US a greater focus on urban health. And I also think that has to do with the context of the environmental justice movement and the deep health inequities that exist, stratified by class and race. What else do you see that's interesting in there? You also have in the US the situation of kind of a bipolar situation of cities that are doing a lot on urban greening and many that are doing nothing on urban greening, as if greening or sustainability is still not part of their agenda. And that's much less frequent in Europe, where you seem to have greening a little bit more along the way. If you also look at our different scores of indicators, what do we find in terms of the relationship between indicators? And that's where we use multiple regression models to try to better understand for whom is the future green city. And what do we find? We do find three things. On the one hand, we see that cities that do a lot of urban greening in terms of the discourses that are being articulated around urban greening also have a lot of projects on the ground. And those projects are also related to economic growth, especially in the service industry. So high level of economic activity and urban greening talk, in a way, go hand in hand, even after controlling for population size. What do we also notice? We notice that the higher the city scores on greening talk or greening rhetoric, the higher housing and other cost of living are. So the greener the city in terms of the image it's producing on itself, also the more implementation there is, but also the more unaffordable it becomes. However, what we also realize that when municipalities integrate social equity and health in greening interventions, so when there is a strong focus on greening for all, that means like an equality focus, when there is a lot of focus on health and revitalization of lower income neighborhoods, then there is no more a statistically significant relationship between greening talk and cost of living. Meaning that cities that have a very clear inclusion and equity lens manage to, in a way, counterbalance the relationship between urban greening growth and unaffordability. And that's an example of Nantes, for instance, one of the cities we are looking at in greater depth. Nantes is one city in France which is located in Brittany. It's a city of 400,000 residents that has done an amazing job in becoming greener all over the city. So it's a city that defines itself as moving from being having gardens in the city to being a city in a garden. And it converted itself from a shipyard industry-based city, so shipyards closed in the 1980s, to a green city that focuses on attracting high-tech industry, so like a lot in the end of cities right now, focusing also on the creative class, but also on health, social inclusion, and livability. And how has it done that? First of all, it has created a lot of small gardens all over the city, together with these deep ecological corridors, and I'm going to show you a few pictures of that also cross the city and connect neighborhoods with one another. So it has used greening as a way to avoid segregation. And it has linked neighborhoods that were more public housing focused neighborhoods with neighborhoods of middle class and upper income, using greening as a connector, using greening as a way to desegregate. It also has a very strong land use instrument, which is called the ZAC. And the ZAC is an instrument that the city uses to say, okay, you have a huge area that is industrial and that is a brownfield. Let's reconvert it into a green space, but with a green space with a high percentage of social housing. So Nantes is the city in France with the highest, or let's say the most stringent rule in terms of what is the percentage of new social housing that has to be built in a redeveloped area. We are at 30%. So for every, let's say, condo complex that needs to be built, that will be built, a third of it is supposed to be for social housing. And what you also have in Nantes, which I think is really interesting, is a process of co-creation, co-design, and co-management of green spaces. And I'll talk very briefly about this now. So that's Nantes. The center of the city, which is this island called l'Île de Nantes, was reconverted from a shipyard area to an area that has a lot of interesting cultural projects taking place in it, and also neighborhoods with high density social housing and also market-based housing. And it has created many parks that are both, again, pocket parks, ecological corridors, connecting parks, and also parks that attract residents from all over the municipality. That's a poussin, so that's a little chick, that was built in one of the historic gardens of the city with the participation of residents. It was built during a festival, and residents were asked to bring 1,000 cushions that they would just basically knit in front of the park before this chick was let's say revealed to the public. And they all stood in front of the park during one day in the summer, and more than 1,000 residents became involved in knitting little cushions so that the chick could just rest in there and have a more comfortable stay during the festival. That's another example of green everywhere in the city. That's a former high-density public income neighborhood that was built in the 1960s, which now is being considered as a neighborhood in a garden. So one of these new models where architecture of this social housing area is really high density, but at the same time high quality, and with a very positive design that is supposed to bring the neighborhood back in the social structure of the city, rather than, again, segregating it. So what do we see for urban greening to move forward in an inclusive way? We need urban greening focused on equality principles and goals. What does that mean? We need greening to be focused on providing green space for everyone in the city, with a goal, for instance, like every resident will live within a quarter of a mile of green space. And that's what Nantes has focused on, rather than having a few flagship projects that make greening attractive for a few residents only. We need deep citizens' participation and exclusion, a focus on health benefits, and a revitalization of underprivileged neighborhoods. I'm very briefly only touching upon the second phase of our analysis. I know we are tight on time, which is basically the demographic real estate development and spatial green data collection and analysis in our 40 cities. So what are we doing here? We are now collecting data. We just finished that phase on what are the parks, what are the green spaces, what are the ecological corridors built in 40 cities since 1990, and how have the demographic and real estate indicators in the neighborhoods where the green spaces have been built evolved over time. So is there a form of green gentrification that has taken place? So are greener cities predicting, in a way, gentrification? And from there, we are not only looking again at the prediction between urban green space, let's say sometimes as a composite variable, and the prediction of this on gentrification, but looking at what are all the factors that could actually define or that could actually explain why greening is playing a role in gentrification. Is it because of the size? Because of the design of these green space, the access, the types of green space, location, or attractiveness? We have a student right now, for instance, who is looking at Flickr and Instagram images to come up with a score of attractiveness of different parts in Barcelona, to try to understand the extent to which different attractiveness characteristics of parts can predict gentrification. What we also need to parse out is what is the role of gentrification, what is the role of green space on gentrification, considering other variables that could also play role, for instance, crime rates? Is it actually because a neighborhood has become lower in crime that actually it has gentrified more than in the end the park? Or what is the relationship between crime, the park, and gentrification? Or does it have to do with retail amenities being built there at the same time, transit access, etc.? We also need to think about antecedent variables. So for instance, where there are urban renewal projects in the neighborhood that also receive the greening treatment. And we also need to think about broader contextual variable. City size. Is it a shrinking city? Is it a growing city? And just to give you an example of Barcelona, for instance, we also need to think that green gentrification happens in different ways in the city. And that's kind of also the message I want to leave, is that green gentrification is not a uniform phenomenon, and sometimes you have neighborhoods that have become much more attractive, like the ones on the waterfront in Barcelona, the darker ones where gentrification is intense, as opposed to the white ones where green gentrification has not happened. I'll leave that.
I met Isabelle when she first came as a grad student, and she asked me a lot of questions about how would she ever finish the PhD, and she was